Okay.
Two or three are gathered together in thy name.
I know. All right.
Really, Jim?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Douglas. I am the Senior Warden of Virginia Research Lodge, and this is our October 19th unstated meeting. Our guest speaker today is Chad Kopenski, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him. Chad, do you have a presentation? Or are you just...
I do. So, hello, everybody. My name is Chad Kopenski. I'm a really nobody of any real consequence, but as I'm getting older, one of the things I am starting to realize is that as Masons, we tend to rest on our laurels and on our accomplishments, and I wish people would talk more about what they're doing as opposed to what they have done. So, what I am doing is I am working on So we're writing my book on John Shearer. The more I tug at that guy, the more I learn and the more questions I have. I'm also currently the sitting master of the Ohio Lodge of Research, and we're trying to do some different and more interesting things there. But my presentation today, and hopefully you can all see a lovely title slide as we're talking. Perfect. So Joe, you want to help me with the Latin on that? Or no?
Unde Venis, Quo Vadis.
Yep. Where are you coming from and where are you going? As with all educational endeavors, here's my standard disclaimer. These are my own, don't represent any entity whose membership is based on Masonic affiliation. And with all educational endeavors, my thoughts or opinions may change in the face of new information, time, experience, or perspective. In the small print are those accomplishments that, if you need them, they're there. Okay. So I've been lucky enough to be the past president of something called the Midwest Conference on Masonic Education. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk a little bit about the conference, but I want to talk about something the conference has here in terms of what's happening across the country in Masonic education, or at least in our member jurisdictions. And then I want to highlight just a few states where they're kind of outliers, those sort of shining stars where just something is happening that we really should all be kind of taking note of and keeping an eye on. Basically, Midwest Conference started in 1949 as a collection of states getting together, the Masonic educators at that, that high level, to gather together to share best practices, to talk about what's going on in their jurisdictions, and really just sort of, share ideas and share best practices. Texas just joined in the last few weeks, which is interesting. Canada, just honestly because of expense, dropped out a few years ago. But we have a yearly gathering that travels from around our member jurisdictions. And in the last few years, what we have done is we have opened up the membership. Instead of just being the guys at the table, right? The Avengers or the Justice League sitting around the table, who work at that really high level. We also have invited people at all levels, at the district level, at the lodge level, at the individual level. Anybody who is interested in Masonic education, to get them to gather together to share ideas, share best practices, to kind of just even talk about what's going on. Part of the conference in the past has been the member jurisdictions getting up and giving a big old report that would be, between 10 and 15 minutes long. This is what's happening in our jurisdiction. For the last few years, as we tried to open it up and make it more of a working conference, we have reduced those reports. We've made them standardized. We've made them kind of a one-page report, and we have reached out to jurisdictions that aren't members of the conference. And with the idea being just getting some standardized information, demographics, how are you structured? How big are you? What are you doing in Masonic education? And by making these reports one page, what we want guys to do is kind of what I've done and kind of what I'm going to ask you all to do is take these sheets, kind of spread them out on a table and do the compare and contrast. In the chat for this, I put this year's jurisdiction reports. And Some of you may want to read along or look at them as I'm talking, but even at your own time, they are well worth just taking a little bit of time and looking at them, seeing what's going on. Because one of the big dangers, I think, especially in Masonry, but especially in Masonic education, is this idea that Masonry somewhere is the same as Masonry everywhere. It is amazing what you find out when you get outside your bubble. And even just basic information put side by side, there's so much you end up questions that pop up. From the jurisdictional reports that we got this year, even just this information, how many lodges, how many members, what's your membership system? But even talking about proficiencies, what is the role of proficiency? Is it short form? Is it long form? How do you define short form or long form? Is it required to go from one degree to the next? And really, when people start talking, they assume that it is the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are themes, there are elements that rhyme, for lack of a better word, but it's not the same. And I'll leave this up because I know that some of you are going to look at this. And if you have questions already, by all means, let me know. But some of the things that are really interesting in here that I will talk about in a little bit is, yes, there's that short form and the long form. Sometimes it's required, sometimes it's not. But there are some jurisdictions that leave it up to the lodges to determine what qualifies.
Excuse me, Chad, what year was this?
Last year. As of
we don't have 300 lodges, but okay.
That's you guys don't? Sure, that's the number that I got.
We're about 280, if that. Okay.
Well, the person I spoke to in February told me 300. So
interesting. All right, sorry.
Next year when I do this, I'll come talk to you. But that lodges determine what proficiency means. So in those jurisdictions, you have some lodges where it's just ritual, and you have some lodges where you have to write, a big, huge hunk of research paper as a requirement to go between the degrees. By spreading out these sheets and by getting the brethren in the room, again, it's interesting what you find. And part of our session also at the conference, but also part of these jurisdiction reports, is this look globally at what we're seeing in Masonic education, the kind of look of where we're going or where we've come from and where we're going. One of the things that we're seeing happening right now is we're seeing this big struggle with what actually qualifies as Masonic education. One of the things that we do when we fill out these sheets is we call the leaders in education in that jurisdiction just to talk to them in a conversation. And we'll ask them, well, how does your jurisdiction define Masonic education? And what we usually get is some weird Venn diagram, kind of like that image there. That Masonic education is defined as relating to something else. Either it's all ritual or it's not ritual, or it's some parts of the ritual or it's not. Sometimes we get a lot of, I think it was Justice Brandeis who said that he didn't know what pornography was, but he knew it when he saw it. That the same thing with Masonic education. Well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. What we're also seeing is the definition of what Masonic education is can oftentimes depend on who the Grand Master is, or what his experience was with education. It is rare to find a jurisdiction that has a specific and formal definition written out of what Masonic education entails. I think Virginia has one or had one at one point, but very few others do. Ohio has this one, which is interesting. Theirs is Masonic education is any activity properly framed that teaches brethren Masonic values and how to incorporate them into their lives. Ohio has tried to facilitate more bottom-up reforms, or at least movements in education. And so this was written purposely vague to allow for lodges and districts and, those different pockets to really customize education for what their brethren and their location need or want. And what they focus on is the idea of properly framed. So that if their Grand Lodge Education Committee comes out with a program, they recognize that it's not going to work in all parts of Ohio, but they want certain principles in place or certain ideas in place so the brethren can take it, contextualize it, and make it relevant to their particular district. We're seeing some jurisdictions go more towards this idea of a more nebulous definition of education, for lack of a better word. In their quest to define education, if you look at many of these jurisdictions over the last 75 years, education is usually a response to something that is not happening in the lodges. We joke that, Grand Lodge doesn't know what education is, but they sure know we need a lot more of it. And that there's a problem, well, just throw some education at it. And so 75 years ago, when lodges were doing boatloads of degrees, the question was, well, what do you do when there aren't degrees? Well, we'll do education. So it's more, they think about it more like entertainment. So 75 years ago, they looked at education as being, well, it's entertainment when we don't have degrees. But then as they started looking at the lodges, they made assumptions of what lodges were doing. And then when they realized there was a deficit, well, then education became sort of defined by what, this deficit in the lodge. And they noticed that with lodges doing all of these degrees, they weren't doing candidate counseling. So then Masonic education got defined more like candidate counseling. This is what you need to know in order to be able to, counsel and make a new Mason. That's the ritual, or, not just the ritual. About 40 years ago, 40 years ago, the mid 80s. And there's what we see across many of the jurisdictions is they recognized that there was a lack of leadership in the lodge. And so there's a big focus on Masonic leadership. But over the last 40 years or so, there's been Masonic leadership is also one of those nebulous definitions, because if you look at the different programs that almost every jurisdiction has put out, whether it's awarded deacons training or the slot training in Virginia, or the effective lodge leader program that Missouri made and Ohio did, leadership isn't defined the same throughout those programs. Either it means actually creating a leader, like somebody who has the ability to lead a group of people, or it ends up being more about that sort of nuts and bolts. How do I craft together and create a lodge? How do I fill out paperwork? How do I create a calendar? How do I do a budget? How do I run a meeting? So it's not about building a leader as much as it is about building an administrator. But jurisdictions keep struggling with this definition of education as being a response to what is lacking in the lodges. And now what we're seeing, and this has been kind of, again, what we've seen over the last 75 years, what we're seeing happening now is that education is being seen as the solution for membership issues, that education is being defined more in terms of its relationship to membership, especially with the idea of development and retention. Development, taking a current member and making them into an actual, overcoming the limitations of the lodge and getting them to be an engaged and informed Mason. Things like Ohio's Royal Schofield Society and its sister in Missouri, which is the Thomas Feibisch Riddick Society, or the Pathfinder from Scottish Rite, is really geared towards the guy who's a Master Mason. He's sitting around asking, I'm a Master Mason, now what? The Zerubbabel Award, which is Ohio, and the Rookie Award in Indiana is geared towards the guy who is also kind of a master mason, but he's a guy who's just been raised. And all of these programs are task oriented, and they are independent of the lodge and independent of a mentor. These programs tend to be a list of things a guy has to do. It could be traveling, it could be research, it could be writing papers, it could be conducting a funeral or learning a lecture, but a person completes a task, they earn points or they complete a level, and at the end of this, they get whatever. They get inducted into a society, they get a golden passport, they get a pin, they get an award. But we're seeing more and more these programs pop up to help give new Master Masons, independent of what happens in a lodge meeting or lodge officers or the lodge itself, a path forward in Masonry. What we're starting to see in small pockets is besides this idea of a path forward for new Masons, we're also starting to see this idea, and it kind of comes almost like the Common Core curriculum that was in vogue 20 years ago, was that there should be a standardization of Masonic knowledge or Masonic experience. That in theory, somebody who's a Master Mason from Virginia, they should, if not have a similar experience, should have a similar level of knowledge regardless of what lodge they come from, what district they come from. That you should be able to go up to anybody who's wearing, a Master Mason apron in a lodge and be confident in what they know and what they've experienced. And more, we're seeing jurisdictions kind of wrestle with that question or go more towards that goal, that being a Master Mason should mean something, and here's exactly what that should mean. To that end, what we are also seeing as part of this kind of like standardization of an experience is looking at different sources or looking at different ways of either standardizing the experience or allowing for different voices in education from entities that have kind of figured it out, for lack of a better word. So I realize it's kind of contradictory, but bear with me here. So Ohio has something called a lodge year in a box. The assumption being that we have lodge education officers who may not know what good lodge education is. And so they've created a kind of a template, a recipe book, for lack of a better word. Here are some great programs that have been developed. And as part of this lodge year in a box are recipes. Take the programs that's in that packet. And then here are some other areas, like here's some podcasts, here's some previous things that are in Grandview. Here are some other things to look at, that if you're a lodge education officer and you know that you've got a particular type of lodge with a particular interest, you can cobble together a meal or a year's worth of Masonic education on a theme using these recipes. We're seeing kind of an embrace of, for lack of a better word, alternative sources, especially looking at lodges of research, different podcasts, looking at TikToks, social media, in terms of groups that have figured it out, the information that they have, and allowing them to come in to help reach brethren that might not otherwise be reached. We're also seeing, as part of this standardization of a Masonic experience or a way of developing brotherhood, that jurisdictions are rethinking proficiencies. That instead of instead of getting rid of long form or short form, or those questions and answers like a principles proficiency or a fact-based thing, that they're leaning into it. They're recognizing that what proficiencies are really about is creating meaningful connections. It's about a guy sitting with another person and talking and teaching him how to be a Mason. And so focusing more on that meaningful connection as opposed to memorizing ritual. There was a report 40 some years ago that said that the two big obstacles to membership were memorization and time commitment, and lodges really bought into that. And what they're seeing now 30 years later is they have guys who don't know the ritual, don't have things memorized, and don't want to spend the time. And so they're looking at ways of reversing that. And one of the ways looking at is sort of reinvesting, recontextualizing, and reemphasizing, the person-to-person proficiencies. So as we look back, again, what we see that jurisdictions are struggling with this definition of Masonic education and what that role is. They've seen it used in different ways, but how they're trying to use it now is with solving the issues of membership, development and retention, also with this idea of making a Master Mason mean something across the state. We're seeing a lot of focus on, or emphasis on, for lack of a better word, non-traditional sources. Lodges of research, especially in places like Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, even Michigan, have really started to emphasize the lodges of research and what they do. Some have actually even turned the entire statewide education program over to the lodges of research. We're seeing a huge rise in Masonic conventions or symposia. Masonicon, Esotericon, Kansas, Masonicon, Kansas, and Chicago. Name a convention. There are a lot more that are coming up. Unique Masonic experiences. There are lodges that provide a unique experience, whether it's someplace like Space Novum in Illinois, or Pentalpha in Indiana, or Goose and Gridiron in Ohio. They might, Arts and Sciences in Ohio, they might call themselves, you might think of them as traditional observance, but that's not really what they are. They provide a different experience. Castle Island Virtual Lodge out of Canada. They are unique Masonic experiences that Grand Lodges are really leaning on in terms of Masonic education. Podcasts, official podcasts and YouTube channels. If you aren't looking at Michigan's Masonic YouTube channel, you just should. It is a masterclass on how to connect with brethren at a personal level, from Grand Lodge to personal level. They also have their museum involved in terms of history and different facts about Masonry, and it really is. They're doing chicken right up there in Michigan. And then again, all the different homegrown podcasts and TikTok and YouTube channels. When I was developing this presentation, I tried to make a list of all the Masonic podcasts that I know about. And honestly, it took up way too many slides, but they're all out there. The best ones last, but there's new ones popping up each week, and they're all interesting in some way, shape, or form. But more and more, it is taking Masonic education out of from that, the Grand Lodge top down, this is what we're going to do, and kind of letting it be what different lodges and brethren and districts needed to be to meet the needs of the brethren. I want to look at a couple of places that you should just be keeping a look at because of how they're doing things. North Dakota, Minnesota, Illinois, and Michigan, for a couple of reasons. Illinois is really interesting because they just disbanded their Grand Lodge Education Committee. Their new Grand Lodge Education chair is doing, for lack of a better word, almost like a listening tour. He is traveling around the state, going to different lodges, different districts, and just listening, finding out what is going on, and finding out what's happening, what they need. And his idea is to, again, get outside of his bubble, to get outside of what he thinks, what he's been told education is, and to find out what it really is at that lodge level, individual level. And Illinois has been very much kind of at the forefront of that movement to make being a Master Mason mean something. That a Master Mason coming out of a lodge in Chicago, and one coming out of Skokie, and one coming out of Springfield, and one coming out of East St. Louis, they should all have a baseline of knowledge or a baseline of experience. And so he's going around trying to find out what that baseline is. It'll be interesting to see what he comes up with. Michigan has been interesting because, again, they also disbanded their Grand Lodge Education Committee, giving a lot of that responsibility over to their Lodge of Research, saying, if you're looking for good programs or good work, go look at their Lodge of Research. For many years, they had a program where they had, for lack of a better word, fraternal consultants, people who would go and visit every lodge, and they would score them on a particular rubric in terms of their performance and their operations. And then it would develop like an individualized educational plan for each lodge. They would take this back to the Grand Lodge office, and then they would dispatch experts who would go to work with each lodge to work on the things that the lodge needed, whether it was operations, or it was candidate counseling, or it was, how to fundraise. And that program just recently is being revamped and rethought. But it was a Grand Lodge really buying into Grand Lodge serving the needs of the individual lodge at a very personal, individualized level. That the Grand Lodge existed to bring resources and just bring them right to bear. And it's interesting to see. We should be watching them to see how that works out. Minnesota. Minnesota has their Grand Lodge Education Chair is probably one of the most prolific writers you will ever meet. He's writing on average 200 articles or pieces per year that is shared throughout Minnesota through their chapter. The Grand Lodge, like the York Rite, Scottish Rite, they're all working together. And so I think at one point it was 12 e-Mason columns, 6 bi-monthly newsletters, 6 like conundrums, which are a trivia challenge, or Masonic Education bulletins, the annual reports. They're putting out a lot of content, and they're doing a lot of traveling and some local symposia to get education into the hands of brethren where they are. Instead of asking brethren to come to Grand Lodge or a big huge education setting, they're going right to the lodge, right to the district. They're going into the doors of the lodge, which is very, very interesting. And the last one I'm going to leave with is one that I think threw us all a little bit for a loop, which was North Dakota. There was a schism or a break between the lodges and Grand Lodge in North Dakota. And it's a story that I don't have time to go in here, but to kind of, I guess, make it simple, for lack of a better word, think of if the lodges that cry like, Grand Lodge, get off our back, if you would just get off our back, we'd be great. And Grand Lodge going, great, have fun, see you later. And that happened probably about 10, 15 years ago, where the lodges were sort of left to their own devices by Grand Lodge. Again, oversimplifying things. And so now what they're finding is that with the limited number of lodges that they don't have guys who can open lodge. They don't have guys who stick around. At one point, they they were looking at membership numbers in terms of when a guy joins and when he's suspended for non-payment of dues, and it was months. It was, just over a year, maybe 18 months. In a vacuum, if lodges aren't getting what they need from Grand Lodge, they're going to get it from someplace. And a lot of what happened in North Dakota was that the shrine moved in, and that the shrine really kind of worked with the lodges. And many people started seeing blue lodges as just the shortcut to the shrine. But again, then the shrine started having a lot of those issues as well in terms of membership. Guys would come in, there's a fast track to the shrine, but then they would be suspended non-payment of dues from both the shrine and Grand Lodge, or from Blue Lodge. And so there is this schism. There is this division between Grand Lodge and the lodges. And the Grand Lodge Education Chair there was, they were trying to figure out what they do and how they do things, how they build those relationships back. Because almost like an absentee parent, right? If they show up after 10 or 15 years, does the kid really want to talk to that parent? There's a lot of animosity that's there. And so what the Grand Lodge officers have done, and what they've committed themselves to do, is they're just going to go and visit lodges, not with the fancy aprons and not with an agenda. They're just going to go and reestablish meaningful connections in those lodges. One brother, one handshake, one moment, one lodge at a time. And the hope is by rebuilding those relationships, they can start then meeting the needs of those lodges. Oftentimes in jurisdictions, when you talk to a lodge about, you've got to do lodge education, they're saying, well, how can we even think about lodge education? And we don't have enough guys to get the lights on. We don't have enough guys to open. We've got a hole in the roof and we need to, fundraise for that. And what North Dakota is saying, yeah, we get that. We totally get that. But let's reestablish the communication first. Let's reestablish the connections first. Let's figure out a way that we can help each other. And the education there is focused more on the meaningful connections between lodges, between Grand Lodge and the constituent lodges. And then they'll move forward. And they just started doing this. And so over the next year, we're going to watch with interest these 4 locations, but we're also going to watch with interest what's happening in education, because it's strong and it's interesting, and it's definitely moving forward in a particular direction. So that's actually all I really had today, unless you want to start editorializing. But I can editorialize forever. But I think it's more, I really wanted to show you some of what's happening and get your thoughts and get your questions. If you hold just a quick second, I have to cough really loudly. And
Okay. While he's coughing.
I don't think he
Excellent
wants
work. Excellent work, Chad. I enjoyed a lot of that. And I made a few, I try to let me write some things down, because he'd say something and I'm like, oh, I got to ask about that. And I finally started writing down because I didn't want to lose all my thoughts. Wow, that's quite a cough. And now Chad's passed out on the floor.
I'm back.
You're right?
Sorry.
Okay, good. You're gone a little too long. All right, Joe, if you want to go first, Joe? I got a couple questions, but if you got a question, you go ahead. Or
No, I was just going to say that that was fantastic. And I saw your presentation at Kansas Masonicon, and I thought this was wonderful as well. Yeah, and I really appreciated your candor. I do have questions, but I will defer to the host.
Okay, let me start with the. Okay, so you bring up something about having a baseline, and I'll try to put this as diplomatically as I can. I agree in the idea, and I guess kind of put this as sort of a question. I don't know. I'll try and formulate it as I'm asking the question. I'm figuring out what I'm going to ask you. You mentioned a baseline, like every Mason should get. He should be at X, Y, and Z before he goes out in the world and all that. Now, is there, I think there's a difference between there's a minimum standard we have to have and a cookie cutter experience. And I think a big problem a lot of people have with traditional observance, what management has with observant lodges is, I fear they want a cookie cutter experience. And I always argue Masonry is not McDonald's. We're not a franchise. You don't walk in and get the same Big Mac everywhere you go. We need to avoid having forcing a cookie cutter experiences. All lodges are exactly alike, while still allowing for that baseline is everyone at least offers this. How's that
Absolutely.
sound?
But, and again, I mean, it's a philosophical argument. I mean, and I can editorialize forever, but, yes, there was that concept back in, the 80s and 90s of making Masonry more like McDonald's, that you in theory could go to you can go to any lodge and get a very similar experience. There's a different focus on this now. And again, it's small little pockets that are starting to grow, which is, you're right. Every lodge has its own unique experience and should be empowered to create that unique personal experience, right? It should mean something to be a member of. Paramuthia is one of my lodges. If you're a Master Mason from Paramuthia, that should mean something, right? You've had a particular experience. But what they're also saying is like, there should be, and I hate to use this term, a lowest common denominator.
No,
maybe it's not the same experience, but that
I shouldn't walk into a lodge and have the senior warden sitting in the north. You know what I mean? I mean, there's a minimum. You know what I mean? It's like something. I should be able to walk into any Virginia lodge and open and close the same, rituals the same. There's bare minimums we should all make sure we offer.
The person should be able to get like a lecture that is, a quality lecture. The person should, if they've been proficient, however they've done their proficiencies, that they should come out with a certain level of knowledge about our symbols, our mysteries, our tenets. If somebody's going to sit in the East, that, you in theory, yes, there's individualities for every lodge, but there should be a baseline of knowledge for a person coming into an officer slot that, that shouldn't depend on lodge, jurisdiction, area of the state. Now, that's a super hard question to answer because, again, it's like the best thing I can talk about is like when Ohio decided to standardize their ritual, it took them like 7 years because everybody said, well, we do it this way, and wasn't willing to give that up.
I hear you. Now, I'll say Virginia has very much a standardization of ritual. As we mentioned, there is a board of certificate. We are top down on ritual, and that's one area where I agree it should be top down. The ritual should be identical everywhere in Virginia. If you take
I'll talk to Kentucky about that, and then we'll.
If you take a few variances in the second section, fine. We got yelled at because we sing a song at the beginning of the second section,
right? And
we sing it really bad, and that's just sort of the thing we've always done. And we got yelled at by our DIW because that's not in the ritual. So it's sort of like you've got to allow. That's what I'm saying. I agree with meeting a minimum standard, but don't allow for individual personality that doesn't violate the minimum standard.
Think about it like this. Think about it instead of a cookie cutter experience. Think about it like the entire aim of the Common Core curriculum, whatever that was that somebody coming out with a high school diploma, whether they're in Oregon, Wisconsin, or they're in Plano, Texas, that that in certain areas, right, math, science, English, whatever, that they have a certain level of competency and a certain level of information in their head. There can be regional differences in terms of how they get there. There can be regional differences of whatever. But if you gave them all the same test, right, that there is a base, that there is a commonality. That was the idea of the Common Core. And that's the question, I think, for lack of a better word now, in some of these jurisdictions, that in theory, there's got to be a something. There's got to be a thing that if you're a Master Mason in Ohio, Minnesota, wherever, that means something. What does that mean? And that's a bigger question. Joe, your eyebrows are doing such amazing things here. So What do you
No,
got?
I was actually going to latch on to the McDonald's analogy that Brother Chris chimed in, but in a totally different way. So, yes, McDonald's is very cookie cutter, right? A Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac. But if you go to McDonald's in Japan, you get a much different experience than you do in
Well, that's
Oklahoma.
some other country though, but anyway, yeah.
But we need to take that a step further, right? So the United States is very across the board, and I'm speaking for all jurisdictions. And again, these are my personal opinions. The United States in general, the jurisdictions within the United States are very monocular in how they see Masonry, right? And that is a very continental experience and way of practicing Freemasonry, right? You go to Europe. Let's talk about the UK, right, where the Mother Grand Lodge of the world, right, came from. Even in the UK, in one jurisdiction, you can experience Masonry in a variety of different ways, right, with a variety of different rituals. It's all under the purview of the same Grand Lodge, but you can have a different experience, and people can go and choose the experience that they want. Going back to the McDonald's analogy, right? I can get a bulgogi burger in South Korea at McDonald's that I can't get in Wisconsin, right? But it's still McDonald's, right? It has those core things that make it McDonald's, right? You get your Happy Meal and you get your fries and whatever, and it's all the same everywhere. But to that point, there's no one-size-fits-all approach there. And I think what some of the things that Chad was talking about in his presentation is, regardless of which, we have this very, jurisdictionally, we have this very monocular way of looking at it, whether it's advertised or not, right? So I'm a Virginia Mason. I'm a Mason in other jurisdictions as well. But, to a typical Virginia Mason, Virginia Masonry is the end-all be-all in Masonry. You go to Minnesota and, Minnesota Masonry is the end-all be-all in Masonry, right? So we don't have this more worldly, open-minded experience set that we should have as Freemasons, because that's what we teach, right? So that's where I like the McDonald's analogy that you go with. But again, we teach Masons to be open-minded and to go out into the world and do Masonic things, right? And the world doesn't stop at the border of your state, right? So I guess that's the point I was going with in that.
Well, I was strictly speaking of within a particular Grand Lodge. Obviously, the Grand Lodge of Virginia can't tell Ohio, here's how you should do stuff. I was always thinking just
that's a whole
within each Grand Lodge. But the whole thing is, I think we're all on the same page that we don't want it. We don't want to force a cookie cutter. You can meet the minimums, but allow for individual personality.
Yeah,
and that's my concern, and I think that's where the observant lodges worry Grand Lodges to a point, is that some Grand Lodges do that. It's too different, but that's a whole deeper discussion. I want to welcome Kurt, who I don't know if we're on a different daylight savings time, but we started at 10. Kurt, but good to have you with us.
So, you guys had other questions or comments or?
Yeah, I want to say hi to Kurt though. Are you? Okay. You're not on mute. You want to say hello, Kurt?
Oh, I was gone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Kurt's a frequent flyer, and it's good to have him here. But he tuned in at 11. I don't know. Normally that happens with the guys in England or something, because we're on daylight savings time. They're not. Whatever. Okay, next question. I'll commentary about podcasts. During COVID, we started using more Zoom meetings and everything else because we couldn't meet in lodge, and that's where this little unstated meeting tradition came about. And we kept doing it. My lodge at the time held like a weekly meeting, I think, and it was just sort of let's all get together and chat just to keep in touch, and that was great. That was just until we got back to lodge. But you're right. There are some podcasts that I find that I really, really like. And if I don't make a point of like bookmarking, like I see them on Facebook and I'll click on it and I'll watch a couple and then I lose it. It's like, unless you make a concerted effort to catalog the ones you like, there's some Zooms. I'm like, yeah, I watched a really good podcast or some kind of YouTube thing, and then I can't find it again. So, but there are a lot out there, and there's probably some I'd really enjoy if I just went digging for more. So
it's not even just podcast. It is TikTok. It is virtual meetings like this. I'm with you, Joe. I think that but if the danger is the bubble, right? That Masonry somewhere is the same as Masonry everywhere, that's a problem. But we have with younger Masons. And granted, I'm 50, so I don't qualify as a younger Mason anymore. I'm 52. But the guys in my lodge who are in their 20s and 30s, their Masonry isn't limited by the stated meeting once a month. They are consuming TikTok. They are going podcasts. They are going to YouTube. And so what that means then is that they're doing exactly this. They're saying, oh, wait, you do it this way, or you think this way. They're comparing those notes. They're making those connections outside of the bubble. And so as a Grand Lodge, if you can either, not even a Grand Lodge, at whatever level, the lodge level, the individual level, you can either, try to clamp down on that, or you can look at it and go, there's something there, and with the proliferation of things like those podcasts and those symposia, you almost have the capitalist idea of the marketplace of ideas. There's so many out there. Some of them are great. Some of them are just awful. I shouldn't say they're just awful. They're not for me, but people are finding them, and the best ones find an audience. And some do need a support from Grand Lodge to say, hey, you should be looking at them. One of the reasons why I like this conference is I find out these things, and I do, really. I'm telling you all, if you're not watching the Michigan YouTube channel, go now. It is a masterclass of what they're doing. Joseph, I feel like I got to throw to you on this one, just because this is you. So
yeah, I do happen to frequent a podcast from time to time, but yeah, no, I think going back to all the way what Chris was saying, I think these things were prevalent enough even before COVID, right? Before we all went to remote land and got comfortable doing things on Zoom. But I think we have to talk about the reasons why. And Chad, you kind of touched on them in your presentation, where a lot of your podcasts that are the old standards, Whence Came You, the Masonic Roundtable, things like that, they were a direct response to, we are not getting education in our lodges, and people are not talking about education. That's why those things came out. And, they've been around for 10 plus years. Whence Came You's been around for far longer than that. But that was a direct response to, I am a Mason and I am not getting education, and I know other people are complaining about the same thing too. So it's been a problem that's arisen for quite a long time. It's not something recent, right? And it's not something that, yes, now to Chris's point, did the move to the couch and COVID and lockdown, did it make it more palatable to people who did not experience Masonry in that way before? 1,000% yes, right? We're seeing people that we never would have seen before sitting at their desk on Zoom and talking about Masonry, right? But to Chad's point, with the rise and ease of use of social media, you also get people out there that are speaking in an uninformed way about Masonry, right? Or going back to what we talked about before, their own personal limited monocular view of how Masonry is, and that's what they're putting out into the world. And unfortunately, if you're scrolling on TikTok and that's you search for Masonry and that's the first thing that pops up, that's how you think Masonry is meant to be experienced, right? So it's a negative there. But yeah, I mean, I can't overstate how important it was that the early 2010s, even a little before that, there were brothers that were leaving the craft or not going to lodge anymore, or just being disenfranchised with Freemasonry because they were not getting education. And that was one of the things that was promised to them when they became a Mason.
Right. But, and again, this is not necessarily part of the presentation, but looking over jurisdictionally, for the last 70 years, we talked about how education was seen as responding to a limitation within the lodge, right? That lodge education was entertainment. A lot of those things came because Grand Lodges made a lot of assumptions about what was happening in a lodge. I did. When I was Grand Lodge Education Chair, I just assumed that there were guys in lodge who knew the ritual well enough to be able to mentor somebody else. I just assumed that guys knew enough to be able to mentor a candidate. But then when I went and looked at lodges, I'm like, wait, hold on. We need to go back and just at least talk about that and look at that, because brethren can only pass on what they've been given. And if they weren't given something, how to, some of them know enough to go looking for it, but some of them don't. They don't have it, they can't give it, and they don't, so it becomes very difficult. But you're right. And again, to your point, one of the wonderful things I think about, them young people is there is so much out there, and they can find it, and they can find the things that, are good, that work for them, that speak for them, that give them what they need. If they need, all esoteric all the time, they can find that somewhere. If they need all history all the time, they can find that. They can find ways to connect, which is brilliant and wonderful and amazing. So
I want to mention Kurt, and thank you for joining us, Kurt. I was teasing you a little because you joined us like an hour late. I don't know how that happened.
Am I?
You're with us. I wanted to point out because you're from Wisconsin. Part of
where in
Chad,
Wisconsin, Kurt?
Janesville.
I'm from Oregon. It's where I grew up.
Oh, okay.
I'm a member of Oregon 151. I'm going to guarantee you and I know at least 10 of the same people.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm the district membership rep right now, and we probably 30% of our people coming in are going to Oregon.
Yeah. So Bone Goldsmith, Jason Laramie's nation or statewide. Ludke's over in I think he's over in Waukesha. But yeah, you and I should talk sometime because we'll just talk about 14 and all the people we know going.
I wanted to mention this because part of Chad's presentation talked a lot about the Midwest, and he mentions Wisconsin and your area. So it should be special interest to you, in particular, what's going on in some of the Grand Lodges there.
Wisconsin has dropped out of the Midwest Conference of Masonic Education. They dropped out about 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And their Grand Lodge Education chair used to be Jason Laramie, who's a very good friend of mine. And we've been working to try to get them back. And we've had a lot of guys come down and talked to a lot of people from Wisconsin. But it's something that the guys can come, but as a state, they have not yet rejoined the conference. So, but they should, because
I'm relatively new. I've been a Mason 5 years, so I'm not familiar with that. What did you say the name of the organization is we dropped out?
It's called the Midwest Conference on Masonic Education. It is a collection of 12 states or so. Actually, everybody in the Midwest except for Wisconsin at this point. And they gather together at Grand Lodge, district, state, individual levels. There's a conference that gets together once a year, and for brethren to exchange best practices, to connect. We had one when we were in Canton 2 years ago. Laramie and a guy named Adam Rigdon came down. This last year we were in Minnesota, and a couple of guys from Wisconsin came over. So Wisconsin's doing some really interesting things. Ludke has his podcast, which is very interesting. They have a speakers competition, which has been really helpful.
Winner of one. Our lodge put together one last year. We came in second. The year before we came in first. So,
yeah, those guys told me I can't compete in that. So even though I'm a Wisconsin Mason, they said that they were nice enough to say that.
I'm glad
it'd be kind of like Brett Favre coming down and playing, So
hey, Chad, can I get you to throw up your slide about who's in the conference?
Oh, sure.
Included, because I was going to make a joke about Virginia is part of the Midwest.
They're not part of the conference. They are.
Go ahead. Can you put up your map for a sec?
Sure. We call them a friendly jurisdiction, meaning that they aren't members. We'd love it if they were.
Right.
But what happens is this. There are people. We want to reach outside of our neck of the woods. Mm-hmm. So we want to. These are the members of the conference, right? So those are these guys right here.
Right.
Texas just joined. But and Wisconsin was a member till I don't remember exactly when. In fact, Mike DeWolf was a past president of the conference.
Right.
But
But if you would show the slide that showed Virginia, like the other states. Okay.
yeah,
So those are the states that are invited to participate in the
We need
Midwest
to-
Conference.
everybody's invited to participate.
Right.
These are the ones when the way that we do our jurisdictional reports is instead of inviting the people to come, we invite them all. But we have one guy who calls all the states and just talks to them and says, and does a Zoom call like this and talks to them for half an hour to an hour and just gets that information, does the interview. Like what are the demographics, but then what's happening? What are the initiatives? What are you working on? What's going on in your state? And Montana, Dan Gardner there. If you've not met or spoken to Dan Gardner, he's amazing. Kentucky, Kentucky's doing some really their lodges of research are doing some really phenomenal work there. I cannot overstate the work that they're doing. And Virginia, Virginia has always been interesting. There's some phenomenal resources you guys have online, but I do know that there's some of the same struggles. And to my mind, again, the benefit of the conference is always people coming together and just sort of whether they find a sympathetic ear, but also seeing what other people are doing, and also sharing best practices, thoughts.
I just want to show you this as a comparison. Let me bring it up real quick. Here, y'all can see that. Virginia, you're already in the Virginia conference. If we go back to the land grants of 1609, I saw this on a map. I tried to find a good example of it. So everything you talked about is already technically in Virginia if we go back to 1609. So we're part of the Midwest as well.
You should invite Alberta and Saskatchewan according to that map.
We just made a claim and just like, that's ours. I couldn't find the one I was looking for where it gradually scales back down, but it starts off basically saying this direction northwest and this direction west is Virginia's until it got
we had
to
a
go
number
further.
of Canadian people who were Canadian jurisdictions. But again, I mean, they're getting smaller cost to travel. It's COVID kind of knocked out a couple of jurisdictions, and we're always going to get them back. The conference really now is trying to focus itself more on not just the Grand Lodge people. I mean, we want them there, but the analogy I've used in the past, whether it's a good one or not, is if you have like the Avengers up in the top of the tower, that's great, but they need to know what Spider-Man and Daredevil and Power Fist and those guys are doing down on the street level.
Right.
They need Luke Cage and Tony Stark to talk to each other, just to sort of make those connections and see what's going on.
Wisconsin is doing some kind of fun things now where they got a podcast, the Further Light podcast that you might know. Chris,
I know. Yep. I know Chris. He and I have spoken a number of times. He actually, one of his first series involved World War II, and he used Alex Herbert. He used Alex Herbert's book on, I can never pronounce it right, that lodge that formed in a concentration camp. And he's at Castle Island Virtual Lodge. He's at my lodge in Ohio, and I think he's in Colorado now. But they're also doing, is it Cholka? There's a number of those guys there. They're also doing they're doing a virtual gathering or a meeting, and we're seeing a lot more of those also at the Grand Lodge level, at a quarterly level. Yeah.
And they just put out this booklet, 10-minute, Masonic lessons that just came out, and I found a really interesting thing on Psalm 133 in there, and that was Pat Choka. I think he wrote about it.
Yeah, Pat's written like 900 of them.
Yeah.
The Wisconsin has a monthly newsletter, and they have an entire page dedicated to education. And usually what they have in there is they have like a lesson along with suggestions for questions that if you They don't have lodge education officers in Wisconsin, though I think you guys just got district education officers this year.
Just did that, yeah.
Yeah, I remember I had some conversations with them about that. And but in the paper that way, sorry, since every Mason gets that, here's this thing that a master or a education officer can love you too, Joe. Talk to you soon. And can use. It's the assumption being that somebody working in Masonic education knows a good Masonic education is, and they may not. And so getting it into their hands, whether it's, again, Ohio's Lodge or in a box, Wisconsin's, I haven't seen that. I knew that it was coming out, but I haven't seen that yet. But yeah, so.
I was going to say before, but Joe left already, but I was going to say, I like your Avengers analogy. I think we just need to rewrite the words in the script. It's like Loki says, we have an army. And Tony Stark says, we have a Chad. So there you go.
I'm nobody. Seriously, I am a has-been. Past education chair, past president, past district education officer, past district deputy.
As I said it in the chat, I don't put nobodies in as guest on my unstated meetings.
Oh,
so there.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I do need to wrap this up because I do have a blood drive to go to. But Chad, I really do appreciate it. And Kurt, I'm sorry that you joined us late, but I'm glad to have you with us. But you can go watch on YouTube.
It started at 9?
It started at 10.
You're on Central Time.
Are you on Central Time?
Yes, on Central Time, and I'm so used to.
Okay. So it is a time zone thing. Okay. Yeah. Well, that hasn't happened before. You've always been here on time. I don't know what it is. That's why I was surprised. Okay.
But I will be looking for it on YouTube because it sounded like it was really interesting.
Absolutely.
Kurt, and somehow we and I should connect because I would love. I bet, especially if your last name is Sorensen, I bet.
I'm friends with both y'all on Facebook. I'll connect y'all through that if that's okay. That's probably the quickest way. I'll do that for y'all. I wanted to say I didn't get a chance to mention it. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Our next unstated is going to be November 16th. Oh wait, I'm sorry. No, wait. Let me double check. November 2nd will be Moises Gomez will be our guest speaker, and he has not confirmed his. Let me see if I have his talk so I can announce that. One second. I was looking ahead, but because I didn't have the title. This is go.
While you're doing that, I'll make one.
Go ahead.
Last commercial announcement. If you Google Midwest Conference on Masonic Education, it's also MCME1949.org. You can get information about our current conference, which is coming up in Indiana in 2025. But you also can see videos, presentations, and these jurisdiction reports from past conferences. And I really do suggest, brethren, I mean, it is great to take these jurisdiction reports over time. And just look at them. It is fascinating what you see when you look at these things globally. So again,
okay.
So thanks.
Okay. So yes. So November 2nd will be Moises Gomez will speak on Freemasonry and the Civil Rights Movement. So that should be most interesting. And I'll read the one I saw after I was going to read, but since Moises, I had a TBD and then I didn't see it. Gordon Mitchie will be our guest speaker. He was a long when we started here. Gordon was a regular attendee for a number of years. He's from Great Britain. He will speak on Earl Haig, soldier and Freemason. He was a field marshal. Gordon is very much involved in his research is mostly about British military officers and members and Freemasonry, famous Masons who were British officers and such. So that's kind of been his focus. He talks about the poppy, he's a big tie to veterans and Masonry and very interesting. So he's much more focused in his talks, but he's been a speaker before. And then Matt Parker is coming up on November 30th, and that'll take us the rest of the year.
Which Matt Parker?
The Matt Parker. The one from North Carolina. The one from North Carolina with the beard.
Gotcha.
Okay. I didn't realize there's more. I'm sure it's a common enough name, but the one who's spoken here on more than one occasion, and it actually came out in person for one of our meetings, which was really cool. That's what's really neat. I mean, when I get guys come in for a Zoom meeting, and Jason Hicks is another one. They're a Zoom guest, and then they actually make it out here for one of our in person stateds, which is really cool. It's neat to meet these guys in person. But again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chad. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry we didn't have a larger audience, but some weeks that's what it is.
So, all right. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. You all take care, and I'll see you all again soon.